Coats on, we have the heat turned on, and by the time you're ready to leave, it might be nice and toasty warm in here. But at least it isn't a blizzard and it's not icy, and I'm so glad to see that so many of you came. We have a very famous speaker today. Rosalie Lippincott gave her talk a year ago on the North Platte Canteen, and it was put on YouTube. And she's had 28 requests to give talks about the North Platte Canteen. She has given 28 talks since then. So we know that she is really popular. And when she gave that talk last year, it just dawned on me that maybe she could talk about Prairie Creek Dance Hall. We had the information, but we didn't have anybody that would put everything together and talk about it. So luckily she said she would, and I'm glad you came to hear her.
Thank you very much, Annette. And I've got a room full of friends, and that is just humbling to me. Thank you for coming. The name of your program's Voices from the Past, and today's program is definitely going to be Voice from the Past. The history of the Prairie Creek Dance Hall that I'm going to give was written in 1977 by Verl Doherty. Verl was a member of this organization and an officer. And I don't know whether any of you present-day officers remember him or not. Do you, Fred? Do you remember Verl Doherty?
No, I don't.
No? Okay. Well, years go by. Mary does and Maxine does. Verl, anyhow, member of the organization and an officer, and he was a Hall County historian. Verl's family and mine were across the road neighbors. Both families had come from Civil War veterans and from homesteaders, early day homesteaders in Hall County. Verl gathered information about churches, schools, cemeteries, landmarks, and people, especially around in the Cameron and the Jackson townships here in the county. He encouraged young people to study local history and document it and then write it down. Well, Verl was my mentor and my friend. He died in 1992. And today, I'd like this program to honor his memory and the hard work that he did for this Hall County Historical Society and for his presentations in Voices from the Past. After World War I, farmers were organizing in order to get better prices for their crops and to elect men who were friends of agriculture. The Grange was one of these organizations. And in the spring of 1919, at a Grange meeting held at District 13 schoolhouse, Mrs. Bill Taggy, Hilda, who one day would become the grandmother of quarterback Jerry Taggy, made the suggestion, why doesn't the Grange build an outdoor platform where we could have dances and get together social meetings? And somebody said, why make it outdoor? Why don't we build a building? And so that was the start of the Grange Hall, later to be called Prairie Creek Dance Hall. Various locations were discussed, and it was decided to build in the southeast corner of Section 32, Cameron Township. This was on homestead land that my grandfather had homesteaded. It was owned then by Dan Dubs. This is 4 miles north of Wood River on what is now Highway 11, and then 4 miles west at the intersection now of Shimmer Road and Bluff Center. Shares were sold, $25 a share, and 32 people bought enough shares so that they could begin building. From the shareholders, officers were elected, a president, a treasurer, and a person who would be responsible for getting the Saturday night, or not Saturday night, just forgetting the dances. Building the hall was a Granger affair from the beginning. Members dug the basement, hauled the sand from the Platte River that went into the concrete that made the foundation and the basement walls. The Grangers were carpenters. They sawed the boards, nailed the boards, put up the walls and the rafters, and did the shingling. A Wood River building contractor drew up the plans, made the work schedule, and acted as the foreman for the building. The building, 100 feet long, 50 feet wide, with a double hung door on the south end for the entry, and another entry on the east side of the building. There would be 9 double barn sash windows hung on the east and west side of the building, and on the south end, a window over the lunch counter and one in the ticket and check stand booth. The basement on the north end was 50 by 40 foot with cement walls and floor. That basement housed the light plant, a furnace, a cook stove, tables for preparing lunch, along with the storage area. The basement could be entered from the building on stairs on the east side of the building, and stairs from the outside. The roof had wooden shingles. The outside walls were covered with drop siding, and the inside walls and the ceiling covered with a cardboard-like siding that was popular at the time. That siding, though, as years went on, began to droop and sag, giving the building on the inside kind of a wavy appearance. But along the east and west walls, securely braced to the walls, were benches for the people, observers sat. Originally, the bandstand was in the center of the room, and dancers danced around it. But in the later years, it was moved to the north end of the building. The floor was sanded with 3 grades of sandpaper and was very, very smooth and highly polished. A bit of floor wax made the floor very good for dancing. Some say in its heyday, Prairie Creek Dance Hall had the best floor of any dance floor between Chicago and the West Coast. But now this, I'm going to just interject. Just recently, I read a history of Riverside Dance Pavilion down in Central City, and they said the same thing about their floor. At first, the hall had settling lights with a pressure tank in the basement, but this was unsatisfactory and was replaced with gas lights that had a generator that ran that. That was replaced when REA came. Floodwaters ruined the furnace, and 2 pot-belly stoves were used for heating. One stove in the northeast corner of the hall, and the other in the opposite corner. But that arrangement was not much better than the others, because it only heated 8 to 10 foot away from the stoves. There were 3 4x4 ventilators on the roof that helped carry heat away during hot summer nights. Each one of those were hinged so they could be opened and shut, enclosed in the winter time. The building was painted white. It looked like a big barn sitting on the edge of a large farm. The building had cost $10,000. Dedication, September 5th, 1919, and a dance was held with roaches, musical monks. Now, I looked up in the dictionary what a monk was, and I couldn't find it. So maybe you know, Marilyn, do you? I don't either. But anyhow, the Roaches musical monks furnished the music for dedication night. The hall was not completely finished, but it was finished good enough that they had the dance. They handed out free candy bars and pop to a very large crowd that filled the hall. And at intermission, it was announced the building will officially be called Prairie Creek Dance Hall. By the way, it was only like a half mile from that old Prairie Creek that meanders through our counties. The hall would be made available to any community gathering free of charge. However, the Grange reserved the right to use it on Tuesday night because they had their meetings and square dances those times. So it was that on a pleasant September evening in 1919, Prairie Creek Hall got its start 94 years ago. It was estimated that there were 1,000 people at that dedication. 250 couples crowded the new dance floor, and the overflow crowd stood outside and just listened to the music. Cars lined both sides of the road on all 4 corners. People had to walk a half mile or more, latecomers, that is. As one entered the south entryway, to the right of that entry was the lunch stand. Under the lunch counter, and under the counter, there was a wooden trough where they put the bottles of pop and then the pieces of ice, of course, to cool the pop. At the east end was a 4-burner stove where hamburgers were fried, placed on the buns, and then sold for a nickel. Pop was a nickel also. On the back shelf, there was gum, candy, and cigarettes. For the first few years, stockholders handled the lunch counter. They bought the meat, the buns, contacted the pop and ice man with their orders, and the proceeds from the lunch stand went into the dance receipts. Mark and Steve Lyons operated the lunch counter. Then later it was turned over to the Taggies, Dan and Leela Dubs, Barney Shepherds, Mr. and Mrs. Jack Halbison from Shelton were some of the lunch counter owners. Those names may be familiar to some of you and may not. Cleaning the hall was done by those who ran the lunch counter. To the left of the door was the cloak, check room, and the ticket booth. Bert Bentley operated that part of the business with many, that was his own business, keeping the cubicles for safe wrapping of dancers' wraps. That was his own business. There was a little gate that the ticket buyers went through, had their hands stamped, and they were ready to dance. At one time, a local artist hung his paintings along the walls around the hall. They were for sale, and they added some color. At first, thievery was a real problem, and a month after the hall opened, William Botchkor had his brand new Ford stolen. Later, it was found up in the hills north of the Prairie Creek Hall on a lonely road, stripped of all its good parts. The open type cars parked along the side of the road in all directions from the hall was an invitation for thievery. Blankets, tools, car jacks, even car seats were stolen. And since these cars had no thief-proof engine switches, cars were easily taken and stripped of all their goodies. But to help with this problem and to make a little money on the side, the neighbor man, Frank Doherty, who was Verl's father, opened a parking lot across the road south of the hall. He fenced off 1 acre, and visualize this, put up a fence 6 foot high, woven wire, and then wrapped barbed wire on top of that. He put a gate with a gas-mantled kerosene lamps on the poles on either side of that little gate, and a driver would pay 25 cents to park his car, and he was given in return a metal tag, 2 metal tags, one to tie on the steering wheel and one to put in his pocket. After the dance, the driver gave his numbers to the assistant at the gate as he left. Mr. Doherty ran this parking lot until the middle 30s, and nothing was ever stolen. With the newer cars in the parking, or that the dancers drove, the parking lot locked was no longer necessary. The gate was left open, and if a driver wished, he could park in there. Since he was at every dance, Doherty was made a deputy sheriff, and then he in turn had some deputies to help with keeping law and order out there. On opening night of the parking lot, there was a Halloween costume dance, and prizes were given for the best costume. And the prizes that opening night went to sisters. I think it was the Allen sisters. And they had, their body was completely covered with corn shucks from head to toe. And they say that the hall had a lot of costume dances, Halloween, New Year's, St. Patrick's Day, for the fun-loving crowds, and there were lots of masks, costumes, noisemakers, and whistles. Because of the craze for ballroom dancing after World War I, dance halls sprung up everywhere. Big cities, wayside places had dance halls to handle people who were smitten with that craze. There were many within the short distance of Prairie Creek Hall. There was the Glovera, Cherry Street, Pier Park, Lions Grove, Shimmers Lake, Sand Krug. I see heads nodding. And then Harmony Hall to the east of Grand Island. Up at Kearney, there was Midway, 1733, and the Armory. Wood River had Moore's Opera House. Shelton had Reddington Hall. Gibbon had Dreamland Village, and at Ravenna, Vanda's Dance Pavilion was south of town. And then in the Bohemian Alps was Antelope Hall. All these places had dances on regular nights, and all were well attended. Prairie Creek may have been out in the country, but word got around that it had a wonderful dance floor, and it drew big crowds. The hall was a great place for round dancing, that smooth, slick floor. Many times the dancers would skip the first few dances because it was too slick to stay upright on the floor. The Grangers on Tuesday night following the Friday night dances were hoping that the slickness had worn off because many of their square dancers took a fall doing their maneuvers. To provide the music, hundreds of dance bands were formed. Any 3 or 4 folks who could play a musical instrument practice together a few times, work up a program of popular tunes, give themselves a catchy name, and they'd be ready to book dances. The price to hire a band for a night at Prairie Creek ranged from $25 to $35 for Tom Miller's Chico Band from Wood River, to $125 for an 8-piece band from Omaha.
Cinco. Tom Miller's Cinco.
Who cares now? That's my son. Some of the big bands that had played in Denver or Chicago got even higher prices. The 20s were boom years, and the hall made plenty of money. The management would pay any amount of money within reason. Bands from all over Nebraska and from out of state were booked. Few bands turned down a chance to play at Prairie Creek Dance Hall. From the beginning, and for 10 or more years, men paid $1 and the ladies got in free. Young men or teenagers who did not know how to dance were let in free also, because of course there was a method there. Once they learned to dance, then they became ticket buyers, of course. The 30s were noted for hard times, low prices, and drought. During those years, the hall served as cheap entertainment for the whole family. Ticket prices were reduced from 25, 35, or 50 cents, and a family could spend the whole evening visiting with their friends and neighbors or dancing and have a social time. Band charges were reduced accordingly. Not many big bands were hired, but there was always some band on hand to provide the music. Wedding dances were popular. The bride and groom rented the hall, hired the band, sold the tickets, and kept the proceeds. Many young couples got a pretty good start in married life on their proceeds from a wedding dance. Some people considered Prairie Creek Hall a sinful and immoral place with all the fighting and the drinking that was carried on. And in the eyes of some, it had a bad reputation. So bad that, in fact, school boards sometimes notified their teachers that they were not to be seen at Prairie Creek Hall. That place, though, was no worse than any other public dance hall. A person got just what he went for to get. If he was looking for a good fight, either as an individual or a gang, perhaps that would happen. If a person wanted moonshine whiskey, he could get that too. During the 20s or 30s, Prohibition was in effect, and anybody who wanted liquor knew where he could find it. Prairie Creek Hall, along with other dance places, were mecca for the area bootlegger. These drink peddlers would hide their products in all four directions from the hall. Quart jars or glass bottles filled with moonshine could be stashed away until a sale was made. Drinking led to a few fistfights, of course. Fight between two drunks usually didn't amount to much, but boy, let a couple sober guys go at it, and that drew a lot of its spectators. Most of these fights were down the road, away from the hall, far enough that the deputies would not break up or fight or arrest an individual. A person who showed any effects of drinking was hustled outside the hall. Anybody caught drinking was hustled out and his bottle was confiscated. And now this is an addition, my addition to this. Not too long ago in the Grand Isle paper, in the Edith Robbins column, you know, that put in past things, well, she put in this recipe for Prohibition drink. So anybody want to copy that down, I'll give you time to get out a paper and pencil. But here's the recipe. You take 35 cents worth of denatured alcohol, mix it with 1 pint of varnish, add 3 ounces of glue, and use 1/4 rose water, shake it well, drink heartily. And that drink might sell for $25 to $30 a gallon. As a part of President Roosevelt's programs, he established the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps for Young Men. Such a camp was at Alma, Nebraska, and often a busload of these boys would come up to Prairie Creek. Usually they were well behaved and good manners, but at times tempers flared between one of these boys and a local young man. And occasionally there was a real Donnybrook between these boys. But if one wanted a good evening of dancing with fun and no unruliness or trouble, he could find that. Inside and on the dance floor, a church social would not have had a better behaved or more orderly group. Nothing was allowed to spoil the fun of the dancers at Prairie Creek Hall. During hard times, everyone was short of money, but the one bright spot for a family was the once-a-week Friday night at Prairie Creek. Everybody hurried to get the field work done so they could get an early start to the dance hall. Dancing was between 9 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning, so that before the dances began, there was much time for socializing. When the music began, Dad and Mom had the first dance, and usually the last dance. But in between, it was every man and woman for themselves, all very natural and informal. There was no need for introductions, no formalities. At intermission, if Dad had a few extra cents in his pocket, there'd be a nickel for a candy bar or a hamburger or a bottle of pop. Little kids held off sleep as long as possible. Then they would be laid on coats and wraps on the floor over in that northeast corner of the hall where couples never danced. There might be 24 sleeping children laying on the floor in that corner. The older kids would be sliding and slipping and chasing all over the floor between dances. Often Mom and Dad would take the kids for a real dance, just like grown-ups. Unattached males might never dance with the same girl during the evening. Many times it was girls he did not even know. And then came the last dance with Home Sweet Home or Good Night Ladies. Mom and Dad would have the last dance. Kids were rounded up, the little ones picked off the floor, and all got into the car and looked for home. Down the road 100 yards, everybody except the driver asleep. The Ted Adams Band from Omaha was very popular and played Prairie Creek often. Not only did this wonderful music provide a joyous evening, but their antics and hijinks on the bandstand were entertaining. This was a 12-piece all-Negro orchestra dressed in railroad engineer overalls and with a red handkerchief around their neck. Their theme song was, "I've been working on the railroad," and to start off each dance, Dancers watched them instead of dancing. They attracted a full house, no matter how and when they played. The Hayes sisters of Grand Island, with their all-girl Danceland Serenaders, there were 6 girls, 3 sisters, the youngest 12. Blanche Brown and her 9-piece Bluebird all-girl orchestra played many times. Then there was a blind piano player, very popular, although the name of the band doesn't seem to be remembered. Lawrence Welk was scheduled one night, but he didn't play. The neighbors said they saw his big touring car in front of the hall late in the afternoon. The car stayed there 5 or 10 minutes and then hurriedly sped off. Sam McClurkin had to do some fast talking to get a replacement for the band that night. But a year or so later, Bill Taggy, who had come from the area up in the Dakotas close to where Welk was well known, and also could speak German so that he and Welk communicated. He talked to Lawrence Welk, and Welk told him, I get $200 for playing. And Bill Taggy said, that's okay, Lawrence, we got $200, we'll pay you $200. But Lawrence Welk finally explained to him that he had a contract with the Glovera, and that the contract he signed said, I will not play within 50 miles of Grand Island, so that prohibited him from playing at Prairie Creek. The largest crowd ever attending a dance was September 1923, when the 12-piece Southern Raga Jazz Band from Lincoln played there. They had just returned from a European tour and had great publicity. On the bandstand in the middle of the floor, the member of this 12-piece orchestra looked out over a solid pack of humanity trying to dance. A single couple could not move until the whole group moved round and round the stand. Packed around the edges of the dance floor were people just to watch and listen, and the same way at the doorway. That night, actual dancing was out of the question, and it was only after intermission, when people had started to leave, that anyone could actually dance to that wonderful music. In the mid-30s, a large globe was suspended from the ceiling above the dance floor. The globe was covered with square mirrors, and as the spotlight shone on it, the globe slowly turned with flashes of light traveling around the hall. A motor was supposed to be attached to the globe, but at the hall it never was. And it was just the motion of the dancers moving that turned the globe. Years later, that same globe turned up at the Glovera and stayed there until the Glovera fire, of course, destroyed that. The decline and eventual end for Prairie Creek Hall started with World War II. People's lives changed. Their living habits and customs changed, and so did Prairie Creek Hall. Gas rationing made trips and travel only when necessary. Tires were rationed. Men were in service, women had jobs. People working day shifts, long hours, were tired and didn't want to go dancing at night. People working night shifts couldn't go. People just felt that there were more important things to do than attending a dance. When the war was over, service personnel came home, war plants closed, rationing taken off, and life sort of returned to a peacetime. But something had happened to the public dance business. New things kept people away from the dance halls. Television was new. Movies were bigger and more spectacular. The music changed, as did the style of dancing, a far cry from couples dancing cheek to cheek to a nice waltz with soft music. Bowling became a craze, and some spent 3 and 4 nights at the bowling alley. All of these things affected dancing at Prairie Creek, and the regular Friday night dances were dropped. In the early 50s, a man from Grand Island leased the hall for his own private business, but it was not successful, and he didn't renew his lease. When the traveling gypsies came through with their van loads of merchandise, it became an auction house. And a few times, it became a polling place. Then there were physical troubles. A violent storm swept through the area, and the building was pushed out of plumb and moved slightly off foundation. 5 12 by 12-foot braces were placed on each side of the building, and those stayed to the very end. With the exception of a new paint job and new roof shingles, that was the only repair that was necessary at Prairie Creek for those 40 years. It was the fire marshal that put an end to Prairie Creek Hall. After the war, all buildings where crowds gather had to be safety inspected. Prairie Creek passed inspection with the addition of fire extinguishers. Those 2 pot-bellied stoves were a fire hazard and could not be used. And by the time dances at the hall, or by that time, dances at the hall during cold weather had been canceled. Finally, in 1955, rules closed Prairie Creek Hall for good. That rule was that in a building where groups gathered, there had to be separate restrooms for men and women. You could see what provided for out there for many years. Of course, this meant that a water system would have to be installed and a waste field, disposable field for the restrooms. Prairie Creek Hall was finished. For 2 years, the building stood alone, lonely and abandoned. The roof leaked, and in places ruining that wonderful floor. The paint peeled, trash and debris banked around the edges. In the spring of 1975, it was put up for sale and was purchased by the Platte Valley Construction Company of Grand Island for $1,820, which paid the 8 remaining stockholders $28.50 for their $25 shares. Don Fredrickson from Alda tore the building down. His brother-in-law, Don Dubbs, living 1/2 mile south, which just happened to be the house that I grew up in, obtained some of the 2-inch white maple flooring and refloored a bedroom in that house. That's all that remained of Prairie Creek Hall. Pete Zeke, the last treasurer, gathered up the receipt books and the records that covered the 38 years. He took them to Bill and Hilda Taggy, for they had been a part of the hall from the very beginning and were the last of the stockholders. Pete told Hilda, "Here are the books and the receipts. Look them over, keep what you want, do with them what you want, and burn the rest." And that's what they did, Maxine. So in 1963, the land was sold. Those big cottonwood trees that had stood in front and to the east of the hall were cut down, the concrete pushed into the open basement, covered over, and the land leveled. Today, Kevin Gill farms that ground, has irrigated row crops on the site. The landmark, Prairie Creek Dance Hall, once known by everybody for miles around, not too many years ago, taking its place in history. Gotta know, are there any memories out there? I know Maxine has some.
Well, which one? I'll just tell one maybe. Take the mic so they can hear. This way I can talk? Yeah. Okay. One of the ones that really surprised me was the mothers brought their babies in baskets and set them on the stage while they danced. So the babies enjoyed the music too, I guess. Sometimes they parked so far away, and one of the memories that I interviewed some people, and they said that the boys would offer them a ride on the running board of the car. Well, of course, the boys were smart, and they just keep right on going. And this one girl jumped off of and hurt herself, but she said, "I didn't tell my mother what happened." Maybe another one that I really got a bang out of, and I can't hardly believe it, but an undertaker had to come out to the area to pick up a body, and he enjoyed Prairie Creek Hall so well that he stopped and enjoyed the dance before he went on home. We covered a lot about the fights. One of them remarked about the good chicken sandwiches, the Hell Bisons. I remember that because that was when I was growing up then. I don't know how many chickens she'd have to cook, and then she'd grind the meat up and then make sandwiches, and they were very tasty. Well, let's see if I can think of another one that I remember. One too about somebody said that they bought a brand new dress, and they didn't know how long it had taken them to save the money to buy that dress. And what happened is that she got the dress caught into the door of the car, and it was muddy. Well, she ruined her dress, and she said, "I don't even remember what happened to my shoes." We talked. I know that another time we didn't have anything talked about the cow dances. The Legion Club in Wood River always had a cow dance, and they would sell chances for a raffle. And then, of course, that was the way the Legion was making money. And this one young man bought a ticket. Well, what did he happen? But he won the cow. And here he was told never to go to that hall. so that's all I've got. So, some of you, the rest of you probably have.
I am curious. I want to see the hands of the people who went to Prairie Creek. Whoever went. Come on. Hi. Get them up. Virginia.
Or any other dance hall.
No, I want to see Prairie Creek. Okay, are there some memories from those folks?
You have to tell them here,
Nobody? Come on, come.
I have one story. I think you probably hear me. Is my voice loud enough for you? Yeah. I grew up in a house 1 mile from Prairie Creek Hall. I lived a mile north. Now, I was little enough in the tagging house, actually. And I went to school at District 13. So this has all been very, very interesting to me. But my parents used to try to go to every dance that was there because they said if they didn't go, their drunken friends would come to the house and drag them down to the dance hall anyway.
Yeah.
I just have a question. I have a question. Does anyone know or remember how long that building was used for the Grange meetings? Because that was the original purpose of it, or at least they used it partially for that. I'm just wondering how long there was a Grange.
Well, you know, I think the Grange died out pretty much by the 30s. I read one time about that, and they really didn't, for a while, every community had a Grange, but for some reason they weren't too successful. There still is a Grange organization in Nebraska, but not like it was.
Thank you.
Well, that's just guesses. Oh, I have a feeling there's some more memories out there that you're just too shy to share. Okay, come on. Stand up some.
Of course. So the girls went around on the west side of the hall, and the boys went around on the east side of the hall.
Well, I had a good time learning about Prairie Creek.